It's probably appropriate that I start with by acknowledging that this is an institution with somewhat of a troubling history related to anti-Semitism and support for Jewish identity. But out of that trouble in the 1990s was born the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education. That trouble brought Rabbi Joseph Edelheit to our faculty, and in turn Dan Wildesen to lead the center and to build the kind of partnerships he's just described. From that difficult start, we have built a community committed to having difficult conversations and remembering what we must remember as the generation that lived through the Holocaust passes. All we have of the Holocaust is a record in film and print, and in those discs we can't get the computer now to use anymore. And it's easier to contest the truth of that history. And so we hear challenges to our collective memory. Scholars like Deborah Lipstadt are important to help us remember, but not just to help us remember, but to teach us the tools to critically assess our history and to remember. And I am deeply honored to welcome her to our campus, to recognize that we're part of a coalition of people who believe this conversation is important to Minnesota, and honored to introduce Joseph Edelheit to introduce her.
Dan Wildesen is far too soft-spoken. Without Dan's leadership and extraordinary quiet perseverance on this campus, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Study would not become the deep, abiding force for good. He was a Silberman Fellow, invited to study at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he studied with Dr. Lipstadt. It was out of that relationship that she has come to the Twin Cities for 5 extraordinary days. So before I acknowledge her, I ask the campus to acknowledge our Director of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Deborah Lipstadt is the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. She is a noted author, scholar, consultant, but she is not a theoretical historian. She is one of those people who has taken the risk of moving from theory into the streets. This week's Bible passage, oh come on, I teach Bible here. This week's passage comes from the story of Noah. And in the Hebrew, God refers to Noah as a tzaddik b'doro. He was a tzaddik, a righteous person in his generation, not compared to anyone else. Deborah Lipstadt is truly that kind of tzaddik b'dorah in her generation. It's one thing to teach the history of denial. It's something else to spend 5 years defending in a British court the obnoxious chicanery of a denier. We are truly blessed to have the opportunity as a learning community to have one of America, no, the world's most significant scholars and activists about the truth about our generation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you very much. I am humbled by those words of those accolades, those words of praise. President Potter, Dan, about whom Joe Edelheit was almost restrained in what he said. Dan envisioned this visit, Dan put it together, Dan worked on it, and Dan even ensured that I had a few minutes in there of time to breathe, for which I am exceptionally grateful. But I'm particularly grateful to be here. And your president very bravely and forthrightly and truthfully spoke of the difficult history of this institution. And I would say, and almost drawing from Jewish tradition, there's a statement made in the Talmud, in the compendium of rabbinic law and lore, B'makom she'ba'alei tshuva umdin, ein tzadik gamur yachol la'amod. In a place where those who have repented, who have rebuilt, who have seen wrongs and done right, the absolute righteous cannot even stand. So that the tradition is saying it's a greater thing, it's one thing to be righteous, but it's a greater thing when you come from a mistake, when you come from having seen something wrong in your midst, whether you've done it or not, but in your community there was something wrong, and you work to repair it, and you work to rebuild, and you work to ensure that it didn't happen, that is real righteousness. So for that I am particularly honored to be here. My topic tonight is, again, as the president said, not a happy topic, not a pleasant topic. But I don't come in a spirit of hysteria or a spirit of saying, oh, dear me, the sky is falling, but a spirit of calling upon us to stop and consider some of the things going on around us in the world today and to ask why. And then for each of you, I won't do it because I think it's up to each of you to do, to think, what small thing can I do possibly to change this? And on some level, my presentation tonight is a bit of a turning point for me. I've long, but when we've talked about anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism, post-Holocaust anti-Semitism, I've often cautioned, and particularly in terms of the United States, but other countries as well, that one shouldn't overreact, that yes, of course there's anti-Semitism, but one shouldn't be always acting like Chicken Little and saying, oh dear me, the sky is falling, things are worse than ever, things are terrible. And often in the study, those who study about prejudice, those who talk about prejudice, sometimes have the inclination to have that kind of attitude, to say, oh my God, things are always getting worse. There are people, particularly within the Jewish community, good friends of mine, who felt much more comfortable, often I would say at the, if you were going to take a spectrum, not at the joy end of the spectrum, but the oi end of the spectrum. They felt that anti-Semitism, the fight against anti-Semitism, was the raison d'etre, was the reason for their Jewish identity, that their role as Jews was to, and their job as Jews and their responsibility as Jews was to fight anti-Semitism. Now, first of all, I don't think it's only Jews who should be fighting anti-Semitism, just like I don't think it's only people of color who should be fighting racism, or only women who should be fighting against rape, because that leaves it up to the victim, and of course it's a much broader problem than that. But I also think that sometimes within the Jewish world, there are those who place and overt and maybe too much of a focus on the fight against anti-Semitism in contrast to all the positives of Jewish tradition, Jewish life, Jewish culture. That the fight against anti-Semitism, as I just said, becomes the motivating factor in their Jewish identity, as opposed to saying, despite anti-Semitism, despite the efforts of the world to be against us, I remain a Jew, I'm strong as a Jew, I'm joyous as a Jew because of what my tradition has to say. It would be akin to a woman for whom the major part of her identity as a woman is the fight against sexism. Instead of saying, despite sexism, I am proud of who I am as a woman because I rejoice in all the wonderful things women have accomplished and women have done. I still believe that. I believe that very strongly. I believe that never should Jews impart to younger Jews the notion that the reason to be a Jew is because there was a Holocaust, or the reason to be a Jew is because of anti-Semitism. I would say, despite the efforts not so only 60 years ago, 65 years ago, 70 years ago, of the Germans to destroy the Jews of Europe, despite the existence of anti-Semitism, Jews should be strong in their identity because of because it's theirs, because of what it has given to the world, and its multifaceted history. Having said that, I also have to acknowledge that we've seen a disturbing, I would almost say dangerous, but certainly at the very least, very disturbing trend in the past 5-6 years, which could have ominous implications in terms of anti-Semitism. Now, before I go to and explore that with you, let me say something which I actually shared with a class here at the university this afternoon, but let me repeat it in terms of well, certainly anti-Semitism. We know that anti-Semitism is a form of what? It's a form, what would we say, just like racism is a form of hatred or prejudice. Think about the etymology of the word prejudice. What's the etymology? Some of you aren't too far from your SATs or ACTs. You still remember etymology. What's the etymology of the word prejudice? Bingo. Prejudge. Or, to put it somewhat more, I don't know, frivolously, don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I know already who is what and what is whom, and I see a Jew, I see someone who is rich, who is conniving, who is sly. I see a African American, I see someone who is shiftless and lazy. I see an Italian, I see someone who is mafioso. I see, I'll give you one that people often laugh at, though it's not, I don't think it's funny at all. I see a pretty young blonde student walking across the campus. I know she is dumb. That's right. It's a stereotype. It's no funnier than, it's not funny at all. It's certainly not funny if you're that student and you know you're not. Or you don't know you're not even, but you're not. Stereotyping it's illogical. There may be Jews who are wealthy. There are Jews who are wealthy. There are Jews who are poor. There are Jews who are shiftless. There are African Americans who are rich. There are Italians who are mafioso, and there are Italians who are sitting on the Supreme Court. There are Italians who are the governor of the state of New York. There are Italians who are in every walk of life. To simply put someone as a characteristic because of who they are is to be prejudiced, to have prejudge who they are simply by their ethnic or religious or racial identity. It's illogical, it's stupid, to use a very high-class academic term, but to call it what it is. But it presents us with a conundrum. Because if it is illogical, if it makes no sense, the minute you start responding to it as if it is something logical, you give it a gravitas which it does not deserve. So, for instance, if you want to respond to the charge that all Jews are rich, you say, no, I know some Jews who are poor, or blacks are shiftless or lazy. You say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I know lots of blacks who are not. What you're doing is you're saying the charge has a legitimacy. Instead of saying that's just completely wacko. again, another very important academic term, but it comes in handy because you get my drift. I could have used a couple of sentences, but wacko got us there much more quickly. And it's dangerous again. So that how do you fight this phenomenon of prejudice, whether it's racial stereotyping, anti-Semitism, sexism, whatever it might be? How do you fight this prejudice without giving the charge a legitimacy? It's a tricky, tricky thing. Now, with that as a context, let's look at what I have chosen to call, and I am certainly not alone, far from it, many of us describe as the new anti-Semitism. What is this new anti-Semitism, and how is it different, Manishkana, how is it different from the old anti-Semitism? Well, there's certainly many things that overlap between the two. Traditional anti-Semitism denied Jews the rights to live as equal members of society. For many of you, certainly many of you whose main focus is the United States, it may be surprising to hear that until late in the 19th century, in certain places even later than that, but certainly late in the 19th century, there were major parts of Europe where Jews did not live as equal citizens. Italy, Germany, and of course in Germany that lasted a very short time. In traditional anti-Semitism, particularly looking at the European arena, it resulted often in the death of Jews, whether through pogroms or through other acts of violence against them. It started out, anti-Semitism for many centuries was a religious phenomenon. It was within the context particularly of Christianity, not only Christianity, but certainly in Europe within the context of Christianity. But in the 19th century, it very easily and smoothly morphed into a secular form of anti-Semitism. In other words, one did not have to be a religious person to be hostile towards Jews. For many years, it came mainly from the right, but not only from the right. Certainly, Marxist societies, communist societies were also strongly anti-Semitic. The way we saw it in this country up until, I would say, sometime after World War II,